I'm Nima Rajan. Liberal leader Justin Trudeau commented on the end of Canada's evacuation efforts in Afghanistan during an election stop in Quebec City. He says efforts will continue to reach the government's target to resettle 20,000 Afghans. Mr. Trudeau commented hours after Canada's military mission at Kabul airport was ended. This comes while some Canadian allies and their families are still trapped in Afghanistan. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says Canada's exit was a failure. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole said on Wednesday Mr. Trudeau had abandoned people there and waited too long to act. At a stop in Surrey, BC, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau said if re-elected, he would also establish a dividend that would see big banks and insurance companies contribute more to an economic bounce back. In Brantford, Ontario, Conservative leader Erin O'Toole promised his government would work with the provinces to invest in mental health. He says the goal is to allow an additional 1 million Canadians to receive treatment each year. The NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, was in Windsor, Ontario, where he promised his party would lower the rates that Canadians pay for cell phones and internet. The last Canadian evacuation flight left Kabul at about midnight Eastern Time. Meanwhile, the federal government is still trying to determine how many Canadians may still be left in Afghanistan. Acting Chief of the Defense Staff, General Wayne Eyre, says Canadian military personnel are taking the withdrawal personally, and many will feel guilty that they had to leave people behind. Calgary-based Imperial Oil has plans to build the largest renewable diesel complex in Canada at its Strathcona refinery near Edmonton. Imperial Oil has announced plans to build a facility near Edmonton that will use blue hydrogen and locally grown crops to produce diesel fuel. It says the facility will produce up to 1 billion litres a year of renewable diesel. But moving ahead with the project will depend on market conditions and government support. The Canada Energy Regulator has approved a change to the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion route to take it around the Coldwater Indian Band. The pipeline was originally set to go right through the nation's land, but the west alternative route will see 18 kilometers of the pipeline rerouted south of Merritt. Trans Mountain applied for the change last fall after years of negotiations with the nation over its concerns about the impact of the pipeline on its water sources. SUNWING has announced the resumption of flights from Ottawa to the Caribbean and Mexico starting in November. The tour company says it will offer vacation packages to 11 different destinations. This is after it halted all flights to sunny destinations last January at the request of the federal government. A group of Canadian IMAMS says there is overwhelming, undeniable scientific evidence for vaccine protection against COVID-19. This comes as they urge members of the Muslim community to get the vaccine. 25 religious leaders have issued a joint statement saying that delaying or avoiding vaccination puts lives in danger. They say this goes against the teachings of Islam. A group of First Nations youth and elders was greeted by dozens of supporters as they stopped in downtown Winnipeg today. They stopped in the city as part of a cross-country bike tour to bring attention to a mental health crisis in northern Manitoba. Riley Nepenak started his bike journey earlier this month in Vancouver and plans to end it in Halifax around the third week of September.
My journey started in Vancouver and I'm on my way to Halifax right after this. I started this for TATASKWEYAK CREE Nation. You know, they've experienced 13 suicides in the past year, and 4 of them just occurred in the last 2 months. I was very surprised that it wasn't bigger news than it should have been. This is huge. You know, everyone, in a way, has been affected by suicide in their life.
Mr. Nepenak is raising funds for the TATASKWEYAK CREE Nation, which declared a state of emergency in July after recent suicides and cases of self-harm. A young Canadian is using her platform to spread awareness about Northern Canada's food insecurity. TikToker Kyra Flaherty, otherwise known as Arctic Makeup, has amassed over 20,000 followers. She is seen discussing the high cost of food in the north, particularly in her home of Nunavut. Ms. Flaherty notes in her videos that the price of food and produce in northern Canada is often double or even triple the price of food in the south. This is making it challenging for people to access not only healthy food, but enough food. A cyclist from Saskatchewan has captured Canada's first medal of the Paralympics in Tokyo. Keely Shaw of Mydale won bronze in the C4 3,000-meter individual pursuit in track cycling. The 27-year-old says it was a grueling race, but pursuit means handling pain. Ms. Shaw was 15 and doing farm chores when a blood vessel in her brain broke, leading to partial paralysis on the left side of her body. All right, stay with us after the break. We take a closer look at the mental health crisis in Canada and what federal party leaders are promising to do about it. We'll be right back after this short break. As Canada continues through its pandemic election, the main federal parties say mental health is a priority. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole made a campaign stop in Brantford, Ontario yesterday to promise that a Tory government would work with the provinces to invest in mental health initiatives. The NDP platform is promising to bring in mental health care coverage to uninsured Canadians, including free prescription medication. They also pledged to build a comprehensive approach to mental health services across the provinces and territories. While the Liberal Party has not yet released its full platform, the party has pledged its support to the public health care system, and experts indicate they expect the party platform to address mental health in some way. Joining us now to give us a deeper look at the mental health crisis in Canada is Ms. Margaret Eaton, National CEO of the Canadian Mental Health Association. Ma'am, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much, Nima.
Now, let's start with this, ma'am. What is the current state of mental health in Canada, and how many Canadians are impacted, especially considering that we're in the fourth wave of the pandemic?
Well, it's not good. So we know that in any regular year, about 1.6 million Canadians have unmet mental health needs. But because of the pandemic, that has gotten even worse. So we know that 40% of Canadians have said that their mental health was impacted, with 48% saying that they've had an increase in anxiety and worry. And that's worse for children and youth who've experienced things like eating disorders, depression, and anxiety. We know substance use is up, opioid use is up, and opioid deaths are up. So Canadians have really suffered during this time.
And we know there were multiple health emergencies, mental health emergencies in Indigenous communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and other communities that may have been hit hardest by this mental health crisis?
Yes, Indigenous communities were hit very hard. We were seeing youth suicide going up, and we know that 54% of Indigenous people said their mental health had worsened during this time. That was true for other vulnerable populations that we looked at as well. So all of these groups, including people with a pre-existing mental health condition, people with disabilities, the LGBTQ population, the unemployed, young people, all said that their mental health had gotten much worse, even worse than the average Canadian had indicated.
All right, ma'am, just over 2 minutes now, but we know the CMHA is calling for federal parties to make mental health a top priority in this election campaign. Where do the main federal leaders stand on this issue so far, and what are your thoughts on their platforms?
Well, we've been so pleased to see the response from the federal parties. All of them have indicated that mental health is important to them. Notably, as you mentioned, the Conservative Party of Canada has identified mental health as one of their top 3 election issues, which was thrilling for us. They're going to increase health transfers to the provinces and territories, provide more support for community mental health, which is great. Similarly, the New Democratic Party is proposing free mental health care for all, as well as universal pharmacare. The Liberal Party of Canada, we're still waiting on their actual mental health commitments, but they've already reconfirmed their commitment to reducing healthcare wait lists, providing more funding for healthcare providers, and we know that their budget in 2021 was very strong on mental health. So we know Canadians understand the importance of mental health right now, like they have never understood it before, and it seems that the federal parties are really listening and responding.
All right, ma'am, let's take a look at the current healthcare system. What would you say is currently missing in the way we handle mental health cases in Canada, and what are the gaps that need to be filled?
Well, it's a very difficult system to navigate. And most Canadians end up going to their family doctor if they're experiencing an issue. But often even those doctors don't know how to navigate the mental health care system. And unless you have a very acute need or an in crisis, that it can be very tough to get care. And even those people have a hard time if they're in rural or remote communities. So we know that 85% of Canadians think mental health services are among the most underfunded services in our healthcare system. So we know that there are places that need to be fixed. So what we want to see is there are things like basic mental health care services that are not covered under our universal healthcare system. And these are things like addiction programs, psychologists, social workers, peer support workers, or things like treatment programs for personality disorders, eating and mood disorders. Most G7 countries have supports for these things. Those treatment programs are free. And while some employer benefits cover some of those costs, that money can run out pretty quickly. So we really want to see this larger investment in mental health to really fix this system and address the deep needs that Canadians experience.
All right, Ms. Eaton, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for joining us today and sharing your messages with us.
Thank you so much, Nima.
All right, don't go away. We've got top national headlines coming up after the break, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after a short break. British Columbia's Ministry of Public Safety says $2,000 is being made available to each household that has been severely affected by wildfires. Households evacuated from the Lytton region are eligible for the funds. It says $1,200 is available for households that have been under a mandatory evacuation order for longer than 10 days in a row. Well, meanwhile, BC has reported one more death and 698 new cases of COVID-19. This makes for a total of 5,356 active infections, including 139 people in hospital. About 35% of the overall cases are located in the Interior Health region. The Health Ministry says 75.4% of eligible residents aged 12 and up are fully vaccinated, while 83.5% have received at least one shot. The province reports people who were not fully vaccinated accounted for 83.3% of overall cases between August 10th and 23rd. Yukon has ended the state of emergency declared due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Premier Sandy Silver says he and other officials believe a more targeted approach is necessary rather than all-encompassing health measures. Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Catherine Elliott, says she is aware the Delta variant is yet to fully hit the territory, but officials are prepared. Alberta is reporting more than 1,000 new cases of COVID-19. The new infections are the highest daily case count since mid-May. There are close to 8,500 active cases. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and Health Minister Tyler Shandro have both said vaccinations are the most effective way to get the province through the pandemic. A Calgary-based bus service is beginning new routes that will connect major communities in Alberta. Canada Bus will have its first trip from Calgary and Edmonton this weekend. It says it is filling the gaps in services after Greyhound pulled all passenger routes in Western Canada in 2018. The company says it will operate on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays for now. The Chief Public Health Officer for the Northwest Territories says the Delta variant of COVID-19 is spreading quickly across the region. Dr. Cami Candola says starting today, masks will be mandatory in all indoor public spaces. Dr. Candola is also extending a lockdown order in communities of Colville Lake and Fort Good Hope until September 4th. The Ontario Hospital Association says a fourth wave of COVID-19 admissions is very likely on its way. Hospital officials say they are also planning for the prospect of additional children under the age of 12 requiring on-site care. CEO Anthony Dale says increased pressure on the industry could also worsen an existing treatment backlog. 3 men have been charged, and police are looking for a fourth in a human trafficking investigation involving a minor west of Toronto. Peel Regional Police say the Specialized Enforcement Bureau began an investigation on Saturday. This came after they received reports that a girl under the age of 18 was being held against her will, violently assaulted, and was being forced into sex work. The girl was taken to hospital with serious non-life-threatening injuries. A cybersecurity expert says Quebec residents worried about the security of the province's vaccine passport system have little to fear. Stephen Lachance says he was pleasantly surprised by the technology behind the smartphone applications. He says they cannot collect location data and aren't connected to a centralized server which protects user privacy. Starting September 1st, Quebec will require people aged 13 and over to show proof of vaccination against COVID-19. Everyone at Dalhousie University will need to be fully vaccinated for the coming school year or be tested twice a week. This includes students, staff, and faculty members. Anyone who is not fully vaccinated or who chooses not to provide proof of vaccination will be required to share their COVID test results with the school on an ongoing basis. Several other universities in the Atlantic region have already introduced similar policies. Police in Nova Scotia are investigating the theft of a large quantity of lobster traps from a commercial property on Victoria Street in Digby. RCMP say they received a complaint of 43 traps stolen last week, and then another 32 traps were taken this week. The total value of the stolen traps is almost $19,000. Anyone with information is asked to call the RCMP or Crime Stoppers. PEI's Department of Health is urging community groups and organizations to apply for funding to help support wellness initiatives. This includes the Community Catalyst Grant, which provides funding for island communities to support small wellness projects. The other is the Health Promotion Impact Grant, which provides up to $10,000 for larger projects aimed at reducing risks of chronic disease. All right, we take a look at what's making news around the world after the break as explosions were recorded outside the Kabul airport. China criticizes the U.S. ahead of a report on the origins of COVID-19. Thousands of indigenous people in Brazil march on the country's Supreme Court ahead of a ruling regarding ancestral territory, and Greek healthcare workers protest against mandatory vaccines. These stories and more coming up next. Stay with us. Russia's foreign ministry has reported 2 explosions outside Afghanistan's Kabul airport. It says 2 suicide attacks have killed at least 13 people and more were wounded. A U.S. official says the complex attack outside Kabul airport is definitely believed to have been carried out by the Islamic State group. The official says members of the U.S. military were wounded in Thursday's attack, which involved 2 suicide bombers and gunmen. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Antony Blinken says as many as 1,500 Americans in Afghanistan may still wait to be evacuated. Mr. Blinken said 4,500 Americans have been flown out of the country. Veterans groups and refugee organizations say countless Afghan allies at risk of the Taliban may be left behind. China is on the offensive ahead of the release of a U.S. intelligence report on the origins of COVID-19. A senior official is accusing the U.S. of politicizing the issue by seeking to pin the blame on China. China, the U.S., and the World Health Organization are entangled in a feud centering on whether the COVID-19 virus could have leaked from a lab in the city of Wuhan. Workers at public hospitals in Greece are holding a 5-hour work stoppage to protest against mandatory vaccinations for healthcare workers. The measure takes effect on September 1st. The government has made it clear that no extension will be granted. Health workers who have not received at least 1 dose of the vaccine by that date or who don't have a certificate of recent recovery will be suspended from work. The Public Hospital Workers Union said that while it supports the vaccines, it opposes making them mandatory. Delta Airlines says it will charge employees on the company's health plan $200 a month if they fail to get vaccinated against COVID-19. The airline's top executive says the levy is necessary because the average hospital stay for the virus costs the airline $50,000. The airline says that as of September 30th, it also will stop providing pay protection to unvaccinated workers who contract COVID-19. U.S. President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett are set to hold their first face-to-face meeting today. Mr. Bennett has made it clear the top priority of his first trip to the U.S. as Prime Minister is to persuade Mr. Biden not to return to the nuclear accord. He argues Iran has already advanced in its uranium enrichment, and sanctions relief would give Iran more resources to back Israel's enemies in the region. A large chunk of Germany's electorate remains undecided going into a federal election. The vote will determine who succeeds Angela Merkel as chancellor after her 16 years in office. Recent surveys show that support for German political parties has flattened out, with none forecast to receive more than a quarter of the vote. Ms. Merkel's center-right Union Bloc and the center-left Social Democrats are neck and neck in the polls. They are closely followed by the environmentalist Greens, who are making their first bid for the chancellorship. North Korea will convene parliament next month to discuss efforts to salvage the economy. This comes following pandemic border closures after decades of mismanagement and U.S.-led sanctions. State media didn't mention any foreign policy discussions expected in the September 28th meeting, but experts say leader Kim Jong-un is facing perhaps the toughest moment of his nearly decade in power. This comes as North Korea maintains a coronavirus lockdown indefinitely and with no prospect in sight to end international sanctions. Thousands of Indigenous people have marched toward Brazil's Supreme Court. The justices are evaluating a lower court's ruling that invalidated an Indigenous group's claim to what it says is its ancestral territory. The lower court based its decision on allegations that the group wasn't occupying the land in October 1988. This was when Brazil's new constitution was signed. The group says it was there. Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro suggested on Wednesday that a change would prompt new requests to officially recognize hundreds of Indigenous territories. A judicial decision from Spain has halted an alternative plan to build a giant telescope in the Canary Islands instead of a preferred site in Hawaii. Construction of the 30-meter telescope on Hawaii's tallest mountain, Mauna Kea, has been stalled by those who say it will desecrate land that is sacred to some native Hawaiians. But a judge there has ruled a public concession for the alternate site in the Canary Islands was invalid. This week, Airbnb opened up its properties to over 20,000 Afghan refugees, offering them houses during these times of crisis. The UN Refugee Agency said last month that roughly 270,000 Afghans had been newly displaced since the beginning of the year, with that number only continuing to grow. CEO Brian Chesky made a statement on Twitter saying that he felt a responsibility to step up and aid in the crisis. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. I'm Nima Rajan, and this was Forum Daily.